So today we're going to talk about science experiments. Last week we talked a lot about observation. So we know the two main ways that scientists learn about new things is through observation and experimentation. So we're going to focus today on how do we do a good science experiment. To start out, I've got two chemicals to show you. This is called Brothemol blue. It's kind of hard to pronounce, but you can see it's a blue color, bromothymol blue, and I've also got some bleach that I'm going to put in this little beaker. So first I'm going to measure out 20 milliliters of this bleach, and I know it's 20 milliliters because I can see if I can show you on here. There's the volume measurements right on the beaker itself. So I measured out 20 milliliters. And before we mix these two chemicals together, I want you to guess what's going to happen. So the question we're trying to answer is, what's going to happen when we mix bromothymol blue and this household bleach? But before I mix them, pause the video and come up with your own guess. What do you think is going to happen when we mix them together? Okay, did you come up with a guess? You know what you just did? You made a hypothesis. So an educated guess, or your best idea of what you think is going to happen, is called a hypothesis. Alright, so now I'm going to mix them together. Let me make sure you have a good view of this. I'm going to pour the bleach in, and if we look carefully, do you notice anything that's happening with the bromothymol blue? Looks to me like it's not as blue as it was. It's getting more clear. I don't know if you can see this clearly on your screen, but it almost looks like a greenish clear color now, and maybe we'll come back to it in a minute or two to continue to observe it and see if it changes colors anymore. So if you guess that the liquid bromothymol blue would change colors when we added bleach to it, you're exactly right. So you made the correct hypothesis. Does anyone have any ideas why, when we do a science experiment, do we need to follow a certain set of rules or a certain method that we do each time? If you can see, let me make sure you can see the full title. A science experiment is a controlled test or investigation to try to answer a question. But we always have to follow the same kind of steps to do a science experiment. Why do you think it is that we need to always follow the scientific method instead of just start mixing things together or cutting things up and looking inside them? If you had the idea, well, we have to make sure that we answer the question correctly, that is definitely part of the answer. So one of the main reasons that we need to always follow the scientific method is because specific steps make it so, number one, someone else could do the same experiment and get the same results that you get, and to make sure that whatever results we get are accurate or correct. So they have to answer the question we're trying to solve, meaning that they're accurate results, they give the correct answer, and it needs to be a repeatable experiment so that whoever follows my instructions that I make for my science experiment is going to get the same results that I got to prove that my answer is correct. If you've heard of the scientific method before, these steps are going to look really familiar, so maybe you can say them with me. The steps of the scientific method. Number one, first we need to come up with a testable question. Does anyone know what that is, a testable question? I know some scholars from last year might remember this. a testable question is something that we can definitely do an experiment to figure out the answer. So we'll come back to that in a little more detail. But the first thing, before we do any experiments, we need to make sure our question is able to be tested in an experiment. So first, we come up with a testable question. Then, just like you did guessing what will happen when we mix two things together, we come up with a hypothesis, or an educated guess, what we think will happen. And then we get to test it out. So there's two parts to testing out our hypothesis. First, we need to make sure we have all the materials we need. And then we need to come up with our step-by-step instructions or procedure. So we make sure we have all the materials, and then we follow the procedure to do our experiment. After we do our experiment, then we need to analyze the data. Does anyone remember from last year, or maybe know just from your own knowledge, what does that mean, analyze data? So when I analyze something, I'm trying to see what it's telling me, try to figure out what it means. So when I try to figure out what the data or information from my experiment tells me, I'm really just trying to decide if the data or what I gathered and observed during the experiment shows that my hypothesis or guess was correct, or if maybe I need to change my hypothesis to something different and find out, hey, you know what I thought was going to happen didn't happen because our results showed something entirely different, which happens a lot in science, and that's really a main way that we learn new things. Finally, the conclusion is when we look at everything and decide, okay, everything that told me in this experiment that my hypothesis was correct, I can now conclude that, yes, I said it correctly. If this experiment that you see in the picture was, will celery soak up different colors of food coloring, we can look at the data or make observations and say, you know what, there is some orange in these leaves, there's some red in these leaves, so my conclusion is that yes, celery can in fact soak up food coloring into its leaves. Alright, so I want you to think back to what a testable question is. Here's some questions, and we're going to decide, at least in the first two of them, are these testable or not testable? So the first one, do ants prefer salty or sweet foods? Is that something that we could test out in a science classroom or a laboratory? Yeah, we could. We could actually get some ants in a container. We could put something sweet, like maybe some Fruit Loops on one side of the container, and something salty, maybe some potato chips crumbled up on the other side. And then we could look and see, did more ants go to the sweet food or did more ants go to the salty food? So we could test that question out and observe and decide, you know what? I think they're going to go to the sweet food because I've just noticed more ants tend to like sweet foods. That's our hypothesis or guess. We test it out, and if we're right, then more ants will go to the Fruit Loops. What about this question? Why is the sky blue? Could we test that out in an experiment? Raise your hand if you think we could. Okay, raise your hand if you don't think we could test that out. Right, why is the sky blue is not really something we could easily test in a science laboratory. We couldn't really get the right materials and try to test out, why is the sky blue? That's one of those questions that scientists might try to figure out through more observation with telescopes and other tools, but we can't really use an experiment to solve that. So I'll let you go back to the slideshow that's posted with this assignment so you can look over those and decide which ones you think you could test out. Alright, all of you came up with a good, oh I'm sorry, this is another slide about testable questions. Again, you will have this to look over yourself, but let's talk about the hypothesis. All of you made a guess, like what would happen to this chemical that you see is still, now it's almost a bright yellowish color. An educated guess or a prediction is a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is not a question, it's a statement. It's a guess what you think is going to happen. All right, who thinks they can say all of the steps before you get going on the next part? Number 1, testable question. Number 2, you come up with your hypothesis. Number 3, you go ahead and test it out. There's 2 parts to step 3. You get your materials together, and then you make your procedure. Then you're going to look at all your data or information you gathered in your experiment and come up with a conclusion. Was my hypothesis correct or not correct? So there's some more slides that you will have time to really look at in detail. It gives you examples and some suggestions of how to, for example, come up with a good materials list, a good procedure that is very detailed, and then gives you some more kind of background and information on how to analyze data, and finally, how to make a good conclusion. So when you study these slides and are very comfortable with the steps of the scientific method, then you are going to take the scientific method Google Forms that has questions for you to answer and even includes a final part where you get to decide what to make your own experiment about. So the last question will get you to start thinking creatively about what you might want to do at home, and we might really get to test some of your ideas out. So good luck. If you have any questions, make sure you send me an email or write your questions on Google Classroom.